I think, gosh, might be my favorite. The psalm tunes for Archbishop
Mm,
Parker's Psalter here. Fascinating, not only musically. I mean, I found it really intelligible
yeah.
personally, and also that the commentary connected with it is really, really interesting to me.
Mhm.
And so these are psalm tunes. It's a selection of psalms. I think there are nine. Am I right?
Yep, there are 9.
9 psalms set here, and Archbishop Parker. Um, this guy was actually the guy whose ordination. He was a validly ordained Catholic priest, and his I guess consecration, is that the word? His consecration as a bishop was the case which was analyzed to see by Rome to see if Anglican orders were valid. So he seems to have been a pretty I read about him on Wikipedia, seems to have been a pretty mild mannered, reclusive, scholarly type himself, and not particularly interested in these big conflicts. But the hapless Parker ended up being kind of the test case for invalid episcopal consecrations.
Yep.
But are they in verse, these English psalms?
They are in verse, and this of course was a big tradition that got started in the Reformation, was taking the Psalms, which are in prose, and putting them into verse, usually rhymed verse, so people could sing them to simple little tunes, so they could be memorized, basically
Right.
putting them into poetry to make them more accessible. And Parker, because he was a literary type of guy, he decided to do his own book of Psalms, and he translated all 150 of them, or paraphrased all 150 of them into English poetry.
I see.
And then at the end of the book, there are 9 musical settings which can be matched with these different translations. Of course, some of the translations are in really strange poetic forms, like the lines are really long or funny shapes, and they don't quite fit with Tallis's music. But what we have are basically 9 little modal settings that you can hear. So you can sing your psalms to any one of these. And the reason there are 9 is 8 of them are in the 8 modes, the 8 modes that were originally associated with chant, the same sort of arrangement of pitches.
Right. This is like the well-tempered clavier for modal music.
Exactly.
Can you kind of explain the medieval modes? I mean, people listening probably know a mode is something like a scale, but I mean kind of like the more deep kind of architectural Gnostic whatever secret wisdom of the modes.
Well, the good news about modes is there is absolutely nothing Gnostic about them inherently. They are, and there have been all kinds of interpretations, but they really are just arrangements of pitches. And the most important thing about a mode is the note that you end on. In fact, you can always determine the mode of a piece by the note you end on, the note where you finally come to a repose, where you finally end the final cadence after everything that's happened. So there are 8 modes. Modes 1 and 2 end on D, so they're very, very broadly equivalent to what we might call a minor, not a minor third, or Dorian. So modes 1 and 2 end on D. And I'll get back to the difference between 1 and 2 in a bit. Modes 3 and 4 end on E, and those are what we'd call the Phrygian modes, and those don't really have an equivalent in the modern tonal system because they have that half step above the final pitch, that E to F, that sort of pungent little interval, which also makes it a nice challenge to try to write harmony on one of those melodies. So modes 1 and 2 end on D, they're based on D. Modes 3 and 4 are based on E. 5 and 6, you guessed it, on F, so a sort of quasi-major arrangement. And then 7 and 8 end on G, so basically a major arrangement with a flat 7th. And then, of course, within those, the melody can go all kinds of places before it comes to its eventual point of repose. And the odd-numbered melodies, the odd-numbered modes, have a higher range. So mode 1, D is where it ends. D is your sort of baseline here. It's going to be where you come in for a landing at the end. But mode 1 pretty much always moves above that D. It goes up, maybe goes up some more, goes down, and then comes to rest on it. Now mode 2 is a little bit different. It also ends in the same place, but it goes above that D. It also goes below it sometimes. It sits a bit lower, doesn't go on these flights of fancy up into the high range like mode 1 does, and finally stops on D. So the odd-numbered modes are what are called authentic, and the even-numbered modes are called plagal, sort of low-lying, you know. So those are the modes. They're really just arrangements of pitches, and apologies if that was too much music theory. Now, as soon as you start getting music in these modes, which as soon as you start getting the medieval repertory of chant, 1,000 years ago, these modes were already in common usage. That's how chant melodies behaved. People started to build up all of this speculative theory around them, saying, they were linked to the various planets, or they had various sort of emotional or ethical interpretations. And, pretty much every music theorist who had an opinion about the sort of deep meaning of the modes interpreted them differently. You have the same mode.
Right.
One person.
But this goes back to Plato.
Yeah,
this goes back to the Greeks.
Yeah, exactly. That goes back. And the musical modes that the Greeks were talking about weren't these medieval arrangements on D, E, F, and G, but they were, they were musical scales. They were modes of melody. And certainly there was a lot of talk about this mode is warlike. If you play something in this mode, people will get their weapons and go out and slaughter each other. And this mode cures diseases. This mode is peaceful. This mode should not be played to anyone under 21 because, it's very dangerous. All that stuff. And you get a lot of that in the Renaissance, and even Archbishop Parker, our fellow who put together this psalm book, he had a little poem talking about the 8 modes and how he saw each one of them, and it's a little bit less speculative than what you get in some of the Greeks and some of the medieval theorists. But yeah, everyone had their views.
Yeah, well, I really liked the passage after the poem where he kind of discusses the kind of I agree with his take on the ethos of these different modes. I mean, he basically says he's not prescribing a rule. He says, for what psalm or song one man's spirit shall judge grave and sad, some other shall think it pleasant. And what one man's ear shall think pleasant, another shall judge it sour and severe. I leave it to every man's spirit as God shall move him, and to every man's ear as nature shall frame him.
That's great.
I don't know what he means by frame there, but yeah. So I basically agree with. That's always been my take on the stuff in Plato about the different modes and stuff. That and the fact that in Plato's time, and in many traditional cultures, a specific mode is really only used in specific social contexts and for specific events, things like that. So you can see why it would be why Plato would say, if you change the music, the laws change, because if everything is so specifically connected to specific, this mode is only played at funerals. You see this with the Indian ragas. I mean, that's still the case. This is only played at this time of year. You can see how that would, create confusion, even without ascribing these things to like an intrinsic quality of this series of notes. Queen Elizabeth and Parker had a close personal association, but according to Wikipedia, she was too conservative for him. He was a married archbishop, and she, despite being the head of the Church of England, thought this was a little bit much. So apparently there's a famous anecdote where she's speaking to, she has dinner at Parker's home and is speaking to his wife, Margaret. And she says, after dinner, she says, "Madam, I may not call you, and mistress, I am ashamed to call you. So I know not what to call you, but yet I do thank you."
Yeah, she can be pretty harsh, but as far as we know, that story is true.
Which is hilarious. That's hilarious.
But yeah.
Okay, so let's listen to this piece, Psalm Tunes for Archbishop Parker's Psalter.
Why flung inside the gentle side?
number 3, of course, you single out in the book, and that is my favorite as well. I love this Phrygian scale. I don't have a keyboard hooked up, or I would play it for people. But you have better pitch than me. So can you sing the Phrygian scale for people before we start?
So if it's based on this note, so it's that
Yeah, so the flat second is what distinguishes it from a normal natural minor scale. But then I guess with some of the resolutions, you end up getting a major resolution in some places. I'm not sure what's quite happening, but it's kind of this Renaissance. You have to resolve major kind of thing.
It's creatively harmonized,
which makes it sound even more kind of it makes it sound even more kind of striking.
In fact, of course, that's the famous one that was borrowed by Vaughan Williams for his Fantasia. He made this beautiful string piece out of it, which is kind of funny because, of course, the Vaughan Williams is very ethereal and sort of romantic. And the Tallis setting is, again, sort of fierce. It's not an atmospheric little ditty. Again, it's not sort of floating along on this sort of cloud of E minor. It's, why fumed in sight the Gentiles' spite? It's why do the nations rage together? And the nations were certainly raging in the 16th century. So it's this kind of fierce piece, and it's interesting that a 20th century composer could make something so different out of it, but so beautiful. And I think it's probably, oddly enough, the best known piece by Tallis, because everyone knows the Vaughan Williams. It gets played on all the classical radio stations. Apparently the most popular classical piece in England, which I find a little hard to believe, but if that's what the polls say.